вообще ничего. the how past two.
Yes. So
We must start at the time.
so they post things like this for panel one.
Yes, yes. We are not.
Good afternoon, and welcome everybody to this roundtable panel one, the role of media to promote transparency and integrity and prevent corruption.
Microphone.
Have we?
Please use the microphone.
We need microphone. Where is the microphone?
Great. Okay. Is it better? Great. So thank you for joining us. Thanks to our guests. I will introduce them after a short introduction. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Michele Di Coletti. I am professor of political philosophy at the University of Trento, Italy, and I have been a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in the past 5 years, and president of the same assembly for 1 semester. And during my activity, I was a rapporteur on a report devoted to anti-corruption strategies, and I had the opportunity to visit some of our 47 countries, not all of them, but Ukraine, Spain, the Netherlands, and Italy, of course, studying the different situations, because our idea is that corruption has, of course, some common features, some common elements, and we need common standards in order to fight against corruption, but at the same time, every country has its own tradition, its own history, and this is why it is important to understand the different context and to try to do our best in order to reaffirm our common values and common principles and common standards in the different contexts. There is not one single solution that we can take from Denmark or Sweden and just to apply and implement in Italy or in other country. This was the idea. And during my visit, I discovered that in every country with different legislation, different institutions, one of the most important word was education, education, education. So fighting against corruption, it is not only a matter of legislation, which is of course important, not only a matter of monitoring by institutions, both national and international, but is also a question of public opinion, education, and in this sense, the role of schools, university, and media is strategic. And this is why during this conference it has been decided to devote one roundtable, this panel, to the role of journalism in fighting against corruption. We will have a short introduction by our guest, 7 or 8 minutes, please not too long at the beginning. And then we will have a lot of time for our discussion. You can intervene, of course, asking your question, but we have also the possibility of writing your question through this technological support, which is, you see on the screen. You just join at slido.com and then put this password, and you can write your question. And when we collect some question, then we will proceed during our discussion. So please to be active during our discussion. We will have at 3:30 a coffee break, 10 minutes, and then we will have time until 4:30 for discussing again. I think that could be useful if during our discussion we can, of course, first of all, clarify some things that our guest will say, but also come to some concrete proposals, if possible, coming from our experience, first of all from the experience of our guests, but also from your experience in the different fields. And this is, I think, an important contribution to the success of our initiative. During this roundtable, we have 5 guests. You see just 4 of them who are sitting here. But there is another 5th, who is Andrew Caruana Galicia, who is following us on Skype. And but I would like to say to Andrew, welcome to this panel. I had the opportunity to meet him and his brother and sister during the visit in Strasbourg, and so I'm very happy to have the possibility to continue our discussion here in Šibenik. First of all, I would like to introduce Mr. Olaf Steenfat. He is the head of the Media Ownership Monitor for Reporters Without Borders from Germany. This morning, in many interventions, there has already been a discussion about the importance of being transparent, not only for politicians, statesmen, enterprises and so on, but also for media owners. We need transparency. Transparency is another key word in fighting against corruption, and I'm very pleased to give the floor to Mr. Steenfat for his introductory remarks. As I said, he will make a short introduction, 7 or 8 minutes, and then during the discussion we will give him the opportunity to present concretely his project. I think that it will be very interesting for all of us. So thank you very much, Mr. Steenfat. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope the microphone works. Does it? Can you hear me? Wonderful. Yes, thank you very much for having us in this famous after-lunch slot where energy and attention is maximum. We'll do our best. There's a very interesting saying, I would say, which summarizes the work of Reporters Without Borders in the defense of journalism and journalists worldwide as a press freedom watchdog and human rights NGO. And the saying goes like, show me what your media landscape looks like and I tell you what country you live in. And I think this illustrates quite nicely the causality and connectivity between the profession of journalists and the environment in which they work. And in media science, there are 2 strands of thinking in this regard. One claims that there is kind of a locomotion effect. So free press and journalists can actually drive the transition of countries towards rule of law, democracy, and pluralistic societies. Where the other kind of conflicting way of thinking and strand in media sciences would claim that, first of all, you need a certain level of media freedom in order to work properly as a journalistic profession. And then there is maybe a third way of thinking that connects the two and sees them more in an iterative cycle, informing each other, and then, you know, the cycle can move either upwards or downwards, and obviously it's usually very difficult to change the direction. Now, I think we can all agree, and we've heard it this morning, and I think we'll hear it again, that of course journalism can play an important role, particularly investigative journalism, to fight corruption, to prevent or to denounce, disclose cases of corruption. But I think it's also fair to say and important to say that journalism can become a target of corruption, or even worse, can become a subject of corruption. Now, I was, of course, very pleased to hear, and I think all of us this morning, repeated calls for the importance and the support of journalists, and particularly investigative journalists. But I think we should also make very clear that if our profession fails to deliver, that there are reasons why this happens. And I'm always tempted to shout really loudly, it's the economy, stupid. And that might surprise you a little bit to hear this from a human rights activist. But more and more also we at Reporters Without Borders begin to understand that sustaining independent journalism requires a healthy media landscape. Or to turn this the other way around, if a media landscape is not healthy, it's almost impossible to keep up independent journalism. And as the economic dimension is concerned, I just in a nutshell might share 3 observations with you regarding the current developments, which might sound already a little bit familiar to you, but just for the sake of completeness. What we face in our profession and industry is a total collapse of business models of the analog media industry currently. Like in any other industry, usually scarcity makes up for very good business, and scarcity was analog media's business model. If you think of the scarcity of terrestrial broadcasting, if you think of scarcity of distribution of newspapers, and what the internet does mainly is ripping up this bottleneck of scarcity and exchange it for abundance of offer. And obviously business models attached to this bottleneck disappear. Now, with this disappearance of business models, what happens next is new kids on the block, a total new range of businesses or media owners and investors. Interestingly, not so much interested in profit anymore. Most of them are happy to take losses because they consider media ownership as an investment in public opinion or as a weapon against competitors or whoever. Think of Jeff Bezos, one of the richest men on earth and founder and a single owner of Amazon, who bought up the Washington Post, I think 3 years ago, which might be philanthropy, which might be, we don't know about his motives, and we cannot judge. Or Al Jazeera. I think none of us in this room has ever seen a commercial, a single commercial on Al Jazeera because they don't sell, because they don't have to. It's the Emir of Qatar who just runs it for whatever reason. And of course, nameless oligarchs of all flavors in different places. And the third observation element in this is that content is no longer king. And that again relates to the business model of the legacy media of the analog past, where you basically take in revenues from subscriptions and advertising, deduct your profit, and reinvest the rest in content, right? You would employ journalists, you would commission production. Now the gatekeepers of our age, platforms mainly, also take in all the revenues. Facebook and Google combined make up for 80 to 90% of global online advertising revenues today. Deduct their profits and reinvest the rest in self-driving cars, nanoscience, technology, which means this amount of money is lacking in content. And as a result, this development, which is not just a dent which goes away, this is permanent, turns our profession precarious in many, many ways, at individual levels, and makes journalists more vulnerable. And this is maybe also very important to state. If we speak about safety of journalists, this has an economic dimension, because those who die are usually not the fully employed, well-paid network correspondents from the capital, but the very vulnerable, part-time, freelance local guys who put themselves in harm's way. It has an institutional level, as said earlier, because no longer profitable media become ripe for all sorts of friendly or unfriendly takeovers. And I think it's also, particularly as we talk to states here and governments, it has a macroeconomic level, because this is an all-out market failure. And usually if there is a market failure in any industry, that triggers all sorts of responses in terms of antitrust proceedings, etc. And a particular attention really deserve local markets. I'm from Germany. I can say in our country we have white spots on the map where almost no journalism exists anymore. If we speak about the fourth estate and you consider the national government and the cabinet table of Ms. Merkel, I think checks and journalistic balances, that's my cue for 8 minutes, I'm sorry. I'll be concluding briefly. I think the fourth estates work well. If you are a local mayor somewhere in the countryside, you can basically do whatever you want, because journalism doesn't exist anymore. And this is, talking about corruption, a big issue. In addressing this, vulnerability, precariousness, market failure, I think we should really applaud the Council of Europe, because all relevant recommendations already exist. Safety of journalism, media transparency ownership, and I'm personally also a member of the current committee of experts on the quality of journalism in the digital age, which will publish its recommendations at the end of next year. So for member states, the policy instruments exist. They are out there. It's all about political will at national levels. And then at Reporters Without Borders, we also decided to not only call for transparency of media ownership, but to go one step further and actually deliver transparency of media ownership. And this is the project I might be able to introduce to you a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stenfat. One of the key words is implementation, as we have heard. We, in many cases, already have laws and institutions, but what is lacking in many countries or in many situations is political will and real implementation by all the actors. And also these other aspects related to the ownership of the media, and also the fact that some media accept the fact that they have no profit, that they have losses in their business. This expose this media to be instruments for other aims, which can be also to protect corrupted people or to defend them and so on. So I think that this is certainly a very important point to consider, and also the vulnerable people who are very often the targets of and the victims, of corruption among journalists. It is also an important point. So we now move to the next speaker, is Will Fitzgibbon from Australia, reporter from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Thank you very much for being here. We know that you had something else to do in Europe, not only this conference, but we appreciate it very much that you decided to be one of our guests. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation. I am one of the reporters who works full-time at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, that's ICIJ. You may, in this room, know us best for the Panama Papers, perhaps in 2016. You heard of that Perhaps you even went so far as to check on our website in the public Panama Papers database to see either if your name was there, or I would hope more likely, or not so likely, the name of your boss or anyone you knew was there. So ICIJ known for the Panama Papers, but also for years really of reporting, in deep investigative reporting with a global flavour and with a corruption, bribery, financial wrongdoing focus. That includes Swiss Leaks, which was a project based on the documents taken from HSBC Private Bank in Switzerland. We also worked on LuxLeaks, which related to documents about corporate activity in Luxembourg. Paradise Papers was the most recent one. So that's years and years of combined investigative reporting that in all cases really has taken us as a network of hundreds of journalists at least 1 year each iteration of those projects to investigate. Because, and it will be no surprise to you, getting to the bottom of corruption, even when you have millions of documents to look through, is a bloody hard thing to do. So I wanted to make a few points about investigative journalism and the role of investigative journalism. And the first one is, of course, that our job as investigative journalists is really to make people who deserve it feel uncomfortable. I, as an investigative journalist, do not feel as though I've done my job if at the end of publishing a story there is not someone or some entity who feels less comfortable in their skin, in their daily life, or in their business activity than they did prior to reading my story. I, of course, am not making someone uncomfortable who we do not believe should be feeling uncomfortable in the name of public interest. I'm not talking about titillating trivia front page celebrity news. I'm talking about deep dark secrets that someone hoped for their whole life would be kept secret, and then lo and behold one day they see it on the front page. Because corruption thrives in darkness. One of the real mind-boggling moments to me throughout the Panama Papers and throughout Swiss Leaks was seeing just how important that secrecy and lack of transparency was for the motivations of people who used law firms like Mossack Fonseca in the Panama Papers. You would read emails from Italian clients who would say, "Can you guarantee me that my name will not fall into the hands of the tax authority?" Or you would read emails from French businessmen saying, "Promise me that I can make this transaction and that you will use the name of my daughter instead of my own name." So secrecy, lack of transparency is the motivator of so many of these transactions, and I think that's the investigative journalist's job to shine a light on that. I also think it's important to note that we as investigative journalists shine light in different ways, and that in different countries that will have different consequences. In a country like Iceland, the Prime Minister resigns a few days after the Panama Papers comes out. In other countries, maybe some in this room, you might have your own examples of people who you think probably should have resigned because of corruption, but haven't. And that's a global phenomenon that we as members of the public, as members of government, and as members of the media, I think, must recognize too. Just because an investigation doesn't lead to a resignation does not mean it's not a successful investigation. And I do believe that we as journalists and members of the public and government should recognize the role that those small incremental victories can play. One of the important points I think is often overlooked when talking about corruption and talking about investigative journalism is how corruption is an ecosystem of actors. There is a tendency, and rightly so in many cases, to focus on the big fish in corruption. We want to go after the minister or the minister's wife who spent £16 million at Harrods one weekend on handbags, and where on earth did she get that money from? What we should also be asking ourselves, what we should also be targeting and reporting on, is who was the banker who allowed that transfer of £16 million from Azerbaijan through a company in Panama to a bank account in London to take place? Who was the real estate agent that decided he or she would not raise any red flags when someone from Nigeria bought 3 multi-million-dollar London properties within the space of 6 months. If the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers have taught me anything, it is that it takes many more people to commit corruption than just the person who receives the fruit of it, and therefore I think it's incumbent on all of us as investigators and as those responding, as you are in this room, to corruption and to the scourge that it represents, to also identify those actors and pay attention to them. I want to make a point about our role as investigative journalists in tackling corruption and the role of others, especially government and those who work in the public sector. There is only so much that journalists can do. We as journalists report, we expose, and then to use a sports analogy, we pass the football to you, right? We pass the football to those who can use that information, go through the judicial system, take actions in terms of regulatory reform, new legislation. And I say that because talk is cheap. We heard some wonderful words in the roundtable panel this morning about legislation that exists, about how we've got whistleblower protections in place, how all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted. But certainly from a journalist's perspective, there needs to be, or there's room for more to be done when it comes to implementing that. As a practical point, I think government and government officials need to be better at leading from the front when it comes to tackling corruption. Reporting on the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, I would have sent over 100 letters with detailed questions to presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, their lawyers, their daughters, their sons, their cousins, with some pretty simple questions. Why did you open a company in the British Virgin Islands? Did you declare your bank account in Switzerland? It doesn't seem to me too much to ask a president or a president's daughter to give me as a journalist a response to that. I don't know if there's anyone in the room from Azerbaijan, but that struck me in the Panama Papers. There was a huge amount of information on the president of Azerbaijan's children and wife in the Panama Papers. I was surprised, I was disappointed that we weren't able to get not a single line response to the questions that we sent regarding that. And I think that it is important that, and I would encourage members of the government and decision makers to lead from the front in that regard. In a similar way, I'd point to an unfortunate recent development within the European Parliament, I believe, in which the Court of Justice upheld a decision that allows members of the European Parliament to have no obligation to disclose certain general expenditures, for example. And we've mentioned transparency here earlier, and I think there's so much that can be done in terms of little baby steps that would encourage members of the public in terms of seeing anti-corruption being done, and would also encourage members of the journalism profession in seeing steps towards anti-corruption being done. And then finally, when it comes to whistleblowers, we as journalists have a role in better protecting and better working with journalists, but also governments here certainly do. One of the reasons I was keen to come to this meeting is that we're here in the heart of Europe, and yet it's in the heart of Europe that one of the most scandalous recent anti-whistleblower actions took place. I'm referring, of course, to LuxLeaks and the decision of Luxembourg authorities to acquiesce to and participate in the prosecution and the persecution of the whistleblowers from the LuxLeaks scandal. It boggles my mind that in a world and a situation where many of your governments in this room came out publicly and said, LuxLeaks is a great thing, we can fix these problems now because of what the whistleblowers have revealed, that simultaneously there were court cases, there were damaging and expensive court cases that went on against the whistleblowers who helped make that happen. So my final point about investigative journalism in 2018 is that, wonderful, we all agree whistleblowers deserve and need protection, but Europe and the member states here can and I think should be at the forefront of making sure that that whistleblower protection is more than just a few words on a piece of paper. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. The example of the Panama Papers is very good. Is an excellent example of the investigative journalism. I have to say that without a contribution of investigative journalists, also in our institution, in the Council of Europe, in the Assembly of the Council of Europe, it would be impossible to discover some unfortunately corrupt cases, and even in an organization which is devoted to fight against corruption and to guarantee transparency at all levels, we had these unfortunate cases, and so the contribution is of the greatest importance. Again, darkness is the landscape in which corruption can live, and also it is important to point out the number of people involved, not only at the beginning or at the end, but there are a lot of people who see and do not denounce what is going on. In this sense, the importance of journalists on one side, whistleblowers on the other side, and of a real custom of accountability for all the people who have to respond and of the behavior. So thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to Andrew. Andrew, are you listening to us? Are you okay? It's coming.
Hello, can you
Hello,
hear me?
Andrea.
Hello, Professor Paletti.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for being with us. As I said before, Andrew is a son of Daphne Caruana Galizia, Malta, and during our conference this morning has been already reminded that it is 1 year tomorrow that your mother was unfortunately assassinated, and I would like to express again our gratitude as institution, but also as citizens, to the great contribution that Daphne has given, and to that your family, because there are not only journalists but also relatives who support and who sometimes are victim of the corrupted people. So thank you very much for what you have done, for what you are continuing doing with your activity, continuing what Daphne has done. And this is the best demonstration that corruption is not going to win in the long run, because there are new people who are ready to continue to fight against corruption. So, Andrea, thank you for being with us, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Nicoletti. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. As you just mentioned, tomorrow is 1 year since my mother was assassinated, and I thought it was important that I be in Malta for that day with my family. There are so many points that I'd like to make, and I'm grateful that I'm the third speaker today, because the two previous speakers have made some important points which I can build on. But I'll try to keep it to one point in particular. Will Fitzgibbon he's just talked about how investigative journalism can be about incremental steps. And he also mentioned the example of the Panama Papers. And for me, that's an extremely powerful example, because it was global. It was a completely global investigation that uncovered wrongdoing across the entire world, from Iceland to Pakistan to my own country in Malta. And as a scientific experiment, it's probably the best thing we have to assess the impact of investigative journalism. And this panel is about the role of investigative journalism in fighting corruption and how investigative journalism can be complementary to law enforcement. And we can see that in certain countries, as soon as stories broke, law enforcement reacted almost with delight at the new facts that were available. We saw this in countries like Belgium and Iceland, and even in Pakistan. In certain other countries, which unfortunately include my own, the reaction from law enforcement was muted. This has two important implications. It means that, first of all, the impact of investigative journalism is blunted. We can say that investigative journalism is good in its own right because it informs the public, and eventually that information could be used at some point in the future when law enforcement authorities have the independence they need to act. But at the same time, for the people breaking the news, breaking these investigations, the situation becomes extremely dangerous because all of a sudden they are the only thing standing between the rule of law and potentially corrupt and powerful people. And we see that repeatedly. It's always in these situations that journalists are either harassed or killed. And we see increasing levels of harassment, not only in places like Mexico, where there are extremely powerful structural factors, but also in places like the Western Balkans, in Southern Europe, and also in Central and Eastern Europe, and increasingly also in Western Europe. But the real point that I want to make is that it's all very well to talk about incremental steps, but one thing I think many of us forget in this discussion is that when corruption becomes so deep that it begins to undermine law enforcement agencies, journalism is not only more dangerous, but it's also less effective. I don't know how many of you in the room are familiar with inverted U-curves, but what an inverted U-curve visualizes is that a certain activity can be extremely effective up until a certain limit. Once that limit is crossed, it becomes not only less effective, but potentially counterproductive, like the difference between eating well and eating too much, drinking a glass of wine, drinking a bottle of whiskey. And what my own mother's case has taught me about the role of investigative journalism in fighting corruption is that investigative journalism can also be plotted on an inverted U-curve, that when corruption becomes so entrenched and journalists so exposed to the subjects of their reporting, that more press freedom can actually make the situation worse. The situation in Malta now is worse than it was before. And one of the reasons it's worse is that my mother's reporting exposed not only wrongdoing at a high level of government, but also the fact that certain institutions were trying to do their work, but were suppressed. And that left those institutions vulnerable to the same kind of retaliation that my mother suffered from. So the solution to this isn't self-censorship. We shouldn't tell investigative journalists, look, if you expose corruption, you are actually going to make the situation worse because the people you're exposing are going to retaliate. And they're going to retaliate so brutally that they'll not only suppress the work of journalists, they will also suppress the freedoms of civil society groups. They'll also suppress academics. And then we'll be left with a situation where everyone is worse off. And the people who are exposed are actually more powerful, more entrenched, and more difficult to investigate and prosecute. So what should we be asking ourselves? I think what we should be looking at is how can we make investigative journalism not only safer, but also more effective, because they are two sides of the same coin. To make journalists' work safer is to make the work effective. And we can do that by pushing law enforcement agencies to follow up on the work of investigative journalists, and also to be aware that when journalists are harassed, threatened, and eventually also murdered, that betrays a deep institutional failure that more press freedom alone will not be able to correct. In fact, quite the opposite. It could make the situation worse unless we look at the root of the problem, which is a lack of independence often of law enforcement agencies. Both a lack of independence and also in Europe, sometimes a lack of competence as well. So if we don't address the shortcomings in law enforcement agencies, that won't mean that investigative journalism will stop. There are enough brave journalists to continue working despite the threats they face. But it will mean that more of them will die and that the work will have less impact. So that's the main point that I wanted to make. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. It was really impressive to listen to your reflection. I think that this is a very important point to consider, because we need journalists who are courageous, who have a strong conscience, strong deontology, but at the same time we need, as said before, a landscape, an alliance between the civil society and the institution. Otherwise, the fight against corruption becomes a kind of solitary fight with victims and without no effective results. This is something so important said by yourself, and I'm sure that in the discussion we will return to this point. So thank you very much, Andrew, for the moment. We now continue with the other guests, and then, as you may know, we will have a discussion, and I hope you can stay with us until 4:30. Okay.
I'll certainly stay. Thank you.
Thank you again. So the next speaker is Sanja Rabutin-Pavic, journalist from Croatia, from the radio television of Croatia. So you are our host in this conference, and we are really looking forward to listening to a Croatian point of view on corruption issue. Thank you, Sanja.
And I'll do it in Croatian because I think the topic is too important to be lost in my own translation. Ulogu istraživačkog novinarstva u borbi protiv korupcije prepoznala je strategija suzbijanja korupcije koju je donio Hrvatski sabor. U strategiji se ističe da svojom djelatnošću mediji ograničavaju zlouporabu moći otkrivanjem sumnjivih poslova i možebitnih korupcijskih afera u politici, gospodarstvu, upravi, pravosuđu. Međutim, koruptivni rizici u samim medijima onemogućuju objektivno informiranje i javni nadzor. Zato već i strategija ističe da borba protiv korupcije u medijima radi očuvanja javnog interesa kao osnovne svrhe medija mora uključivati razotkrivanje netransparentnih vlasničkih struktura i načina financiranja, osiguranje poštivanja profesionalnih standarda novinarske prakse te jačanja mehanizama zaštite prava građana na kvalitetnu i vjerodostojnu informaciju. Okay. Što sve otežava ostvarivanje uloge medija u borbi protiv korupcije analizirano je na tematskoj sjednici Nacionalnog vijeća za praćenje provedbe strategije suzbijanja korupcije u povodu Dana slobode medija. To Nacionalno vijeće je zapravo tijelo pri Hrvatskom saboru koje analizira način na koji se provodi strategija. Tada je potpredsjednica Hrvatskog novinarskog društva Slavica Lukić zapravo imala jako dobro izlaganje u kojem je upozorila da iako je medija više nego ikad gospodarska kriza dovela je u mnogim redakcijama do klijentelističkih odnosa i pretvaranja novinarstva u reklamu. Interes medija postaje profit, a ne javni interes, a pravo istraživačko novinarstvo za mnoge je redakcije jednostavno postalo preskupo. U medijima su drastično promijenjene uloge urednika koji moraju biti lojalni isključivo vlasniku i često su pod pritiskom da krše profesionalna pravila za potrebe profita. Novinari koji nastoje očuvati profesionalni integritet često ostaju bez posla. Gospodarska kriza prije 10-ak godina bila je izgovor poslodavcima za otpuštanje novinara, pogotovo iskusnijih. Novinarstvo se počelo pretvarati u PR, a mediji se sve više trude štampati novac. Takvi mediji ne mogu razotkrivati korupciju jer su i sami dio problema. Interes medijske industrije je da uveća profit, a ne da služi javnosti, upozorava Hrvatsko novinarsko društvo i to se sve češće pojavljuje kao problem. Stoga hrvatski novinari okupljeni u Hrvatskom novinarskom društvu upozoravaju da je slobodno novinarstvo javno dobro, da ne može biti samo problem novinara i njihovih cehovskih udruga, da ne može biti prepušteno čudima tržišta i logici profita i da se tu mora uključiti država. Poseban je problem financiranje lokalnih medija, ono o čemu je govorio i Olaf. Dakle, mediji koji se financiraju iz lokalnih proračuna ovise izravno o lokalnim političarima i kriteriji dodjele javnog novca lokalnim medijima su krajnje nejasni i netransparentni. Istraživanje koje je provela kolegica Melisa Skender iz Hrvatskog novinarskog društva pokazalo je da je u protekle 2 godine, 2016. i 2017. lokalnim medijima isplaćeno više od 120 milijuna kuna. To je negdje, ako dobro računamo, oko 16 milijuna eura i to bez troškova tiska službenih glasila, oglasa, usluga održavanja web stranica i angažiranja agencija za marketing. Dakle, to je u prosjeku oko 60 milijuna kuna godišnje javnoga novca, 8,5 milijuna eura, koji se dodjeljuje bez ikakvih jasnih kriterija. I postavlja se pitanje, ako o dodjeli novca odlučuju lokalni moćnici, kako mediji mogu biti kritični i preispitivati postupke tih istih lokalnih vlasti? Jer buduće kritičkim se pisanjem izražu u izravnom riziku da im u buduće sredstva budu uskraćena, a to se zapravo vrlo često i događa. Kako bi se mediji mogli uspješno boriti protiv korupcije, važan je i zakonodavni okvir. U posljednjih 5 godina imamo povjerenicu za pristup informacijama, ona sada upravo zaključuje svoj prvi 5-godišnji mandat i tu je napravljen veliki napredak u dostupnosti medijima, otvorenosti informacija. Napredak je postignut i u uključivanju javnosti u postupak donošenja zakona, uspostavljen je online sustav za e-savjetovanja i raste broj savjetovanja, tako da se građani izravno mogu uključiti, a time i novinari, u zakone koji se donose u parlamentu, parlamentarnu proceduru. U postupku donošenja je Zakon o zaštiti prijavitelja nepravilnosti, to jest zaštite zviždača. Hrvatska će prvi puta dobiti sada Zakon o zaštiti zviždača. On je u petak prošao prvo čitanje u Hrvatskom saboru. U Hrvatskom parlamentu postoji postupak 2 čitanja zakona. Znači sada se priprema konačni prijedlog, stoga bismo ga uskoro i mogli dobiti. I na kraju, posljednja stvar o kojoj bih htjela govoriti, da je u borbi protiv korupcije za novinare dobra vijest mozaik veza. To je alat koji istraživačkim novinarima, aktivistima i znanstvenoj zajednici, zainteresiranoj javnosti, omogućuje istraživanje međusobnih veza politički izloženih osoba, kao i njihovih veza s drugim pravnim i fizičkim osobama. To je alat koji je razvila nevladina organizacija GONG i predstavljen je prošli mjesec. Za sada su u njemu podaci iz sudskog registra, registra udruga, registra neprofitnih organizacija, isplate iz državne riznice, funkcije u tijelima javne vlasti kao i imovinske kartice. Sada već registar obuhvaća 4 milijuna podataka o 390.000 fizičkih i 280.000 pravnih osoba, što pretpostavlja nekih 900.000 veza. Međutim, nije svaka dobra vijest ujedno i dobra, naime GONG još nije dobio pristup obrtnom registru, registru obrtnika, zatim registru poreznih dužnika, imovinskim karticama sudaca, registru koncesija i najvažnije registru stvarnih vlasnika. A taj bi registar prema europskoj direktivi trebao biti otvoren do kraja 2019. Također, GONG upozorava da zbog potencijalno visokih troškova dobivanja informacija od javnih tijela koje se ponekad plaćaju, mozaik veza možda neće moći nastaviti s dodavanjem novih registara, a to se s obzirom na važnost projekta sigurno ne smije dogoditi. Eto.
Thank you very much for all this information that you have given us about the Croatian situation, legislation and register and so on. And thank you also again for having mentioned the importance of money, both for journalists, because investigative journalists cost a lot of money also to the media. And again, the question of local media, maybe Mr. Stenfader can say something also about the media ownership at a local level. But I would like now to give the floor to our last speaker, Natalie Sedleska, investigative reporter, chief editor and host of investigative TV show Shames Corruption in Detail from Ukraine. Thank you very much for being here. You have the floor.
Sorry. So for the last 4 years, Ukrainian army is protecting our country's border from Russian aggression on the east of the country. And our army fights not only for Ukrainian territory, it protects eastern borderline of the Europe. Thousands of lives was already taken by this war. But being a European country is not only about physical territories, it is also about democratic values. And in these very complex conditions, the society is pushing hard for reaching democracy, and there is no signs that Ukrainians are going to give up. In this process, I believe that free independent media plays a unique role and applies huge responsibility, on our shoulders. And I'd like to share some of insights. I run a television project which is called Schemes. It is an investigative program supported by the American Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty. And we are a group of 7 journalists, and we investigate corruption schemes of the most high-ranking officials in Ukraine. We are on air once a week, and I must admit that unfortunately for Ukraine, there is still enough material to report about on such a regular basis. As was mentioned by you, Olaf, to understand better what's the role of independent investigative journalism in countries like mine, I shortly explain how our media landscape looks like. Even after the revolution of dignity in Ukraine in 2014, politics in Ukraine is still controlled by the oligarchs, and the main instrument for them is media. Oligarchs and politicians own the biggest media outlets and unfortunately use them to gain their goals in politics and corrupted business sometimes, or even often, built on state resources. And by different reasons, journalists agree to work in such conditions and under such rules. But in times of war with Russia, not less depressing is the fact of existence of pro-Russian media outlets in Ukraine, whose work is nothing else than propaganda, and it has nothing to do with journalism. Those play the most destabilizing role in a non-constructive way. And finally, there are a few independent media outlets, mostly supported by the Western grant organizations or with some local crowdfunding. Their values are promoting democracy using best journalistic standards of reporting. Even though they are struggling to reach wide audience, they are influential. That's the source of most truthful reporting and fact-based investigations, and the source of problems for kleptocrats, corruptioners, and those empowered. As an example of what just we recently uncovered and why those who rule the country are not very happy with us. For example, we described how president's close allies received a license to produce oil and gas from one of the biggest gas fields in Ukraine for 20 times cheaper than it should cost in case of open competition. We uncovered how son of Minister of Interior Affairs is selling military backpacks to National Guard, bypassing the legal tender procedure. Ukraine is not a rich country, and as you know, it is dependent, at least partially, from money from the IMF and other financial institutions. But we found out, for example, that Ukrainian general prosecutors spent $50,000 just for one New Year vacation. And he says that average Ukrainian would afford it, which is not true, of course. Ukrainian judicial system is unreformed and is very corrupt, but we found luxury properties of Ukrainian judges around Europe, in Spain, in Germany, in London, in Austria. It's absolutely uncomparable with their official income, which they get from the state budget. And there is no other explanation. Those are huge bribes parked into luxury real estate in countries on the West. And I do believe that one day it will be a subject of asset recovery process. As the chief editor of Independent Anti-Corruption Program, I must stress, even after the revolution, I don't see the understanding through Ukrainian political elites for the existence and importance to have independent press in the country. Moreover, those who rule the country are simply not interested in this. And the explanation is simple. It is corruption. The willingness to keep enriching themselves from the state budget resources without a need to respond for a criticism. It is unsafe to expose corruption elsewhere, and Ukraine is not. Thank you. And Ukraine is not the happy exception. And it's not only about journalists. I must stress that during last 1 year, there were around 50 physical attacks on activists. Many of them are uncovering corruption in regions, but there is one thing in common. These physical attacks or have not been investigated at all by local law enforcement agencies, or the process goes very slow and only under the pressure of the society. This raises question to whom such law enforcement serve, to the regular people or those who came to power and may be interested to stay as much longer, even by illegal means. At the same time, there is a great demand for the independent reporting in Ukraine. That's why it is influential and makes difference step by step. There would not be interference into journalists' work if it wasn't influencing big processes. But the understanding of the high importance of the existence of strong independent media should still grow in countries like mine. Also, there is a great example of cooperation within the active society groups. Yes, each of our investigations is widely discussed besides the decision makers in the country. And also lawyers from the anti-corruption NGOs often translate them to a legal language and send to law enforcement. And finally, newly established anti-corruption bodies such as National Anti-Corruption Bureau and Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office do launch official criminal investigations based on our materials. That's a step forward if to compare with, for example, 5 years ago, when it was mainly complete ignorance of such revelations by the state authorities. And finally, we are approaching presidential and parliamentary campaign. Elections are coming in Ukraine, and many say it won't be fight of ideas and values, but most likely the fight of fakes and dirty technologies. And it will be a huge challenge and big test for those who work in media and serve to the society and not to the politicians and oligarchs. But we will try to do our best. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for this presentation, for this very frank and open reconstruction of the Ukrainian situation, also for having reminded us the difficult situation of conflicts that you are suffering, of course, and fight against corruption has something to do also with the concrete situation of countries, and the situation is not ideal everywhere. And the other point I want to mention is the importance of the independent judiciary power, which is a key point in all countries, I would say. We can have a good legislation, we can have a good public opinion, we can have investigative journalists, but at the end of the day, if the judiciary power are not independent and they cover what has been uncovered by journalists, the result is nothing. So this is certainly a key point. Well, we now have the information that the coffee break will be at 4 o'clock. And so we have time now for discussion. There are some questions that you can see on the screen. Some of the questions can be asked, of course, here using the microphone. Well, I would like to start with the second one, with so much bad news. Are we winning or losing the fight against corruption? I think that if we want to fight against cancer, we need to be aware of the existence of the problem and of the real dimension. This is not to discourage us, but to give the real dimension of what we are fighting against. But I would like to listen also to the reaction of our guest. Do we need all this bad news, or we do need also some good news sometimes? Would you like to start with the...
Real news. They are good or bad, but they are real. Reality is what matters. So I hope that we'll not lose the battle. That's the job of journalists, to uncover everything, and as good news and bad news, same.
Great, thank you. Olaf.
I mean, frankly, also as a journalist myself, I can say it's not like we go after bad news in the first place. Maybe at the end of a research period, it turns then out to be bad news. But the question sounds a bit to me like asking a firefighter, do we need so much fire or car accidents? I mean, that's just a professional responsibility journalists have, and we don't make judgments, I think.
I would just add that we think that each revelation, each investigation is a good news, because otherwise it would be kept in dark. So it's a good news that it's revealed.
Okay, yes, I think that this is a good point. If the enemy is darkness, in any case, our battle for transparency need also this. But in any case, the good news that I have learned from my studying a bit about the history of corruption is that we can win our battle. 2 centuries ago also, the UK was one of the most corrupted countries, and they were successful in building new institutions, new public opinion. So there is not one country which is condemned to be more corrupted than another. It is something that can be fought with some success. Yeah. Yeah. Good. The first question was for Will about the right to be forgotten. Would you like to answer, Will?
Sure. At least once every month, more often once a week, a big, scary, thick document will come in the mail to ICIJ's office, and it'll have on it the name of London or New York or Germany or Belgium's most expensive law firm. And it will be ferocious. It'll say, "Dear ICIJ, due to Europe's new right to be forgotten law, we demand that you take down every single reference of mention to our client, Mr. XYZ. Thankfully, because we're in the United States, my understanding is that we don't have to, and we might send a nice reply declining that request. But I think it goes to an interesting point. The right to be forgotten is, I agree with the question, I think, a potential new tool in the arsenal of those who commit acts of corruption to avoid detection and to continue to operate in the shadows. I do think that's true. The very fact that we're seeing people use this legislation and to use the world's most expensive lawyers to try and beat journalists around the head in order to keep their name out of the public is an indication that legislation like this does risk being misused. I think it also goes to a broader point, which is that corrupt individuals and corrupt actions will always find new tools to try and stay one step ahead of what journalists are reporting on and what legislation is being introduced to try and fix the problem. It might be trying to rely on spurious grounds of privacy. It also, in the context I'm more familiar with, might be moving to a different tax haven. So instead of going to Panama, where I think we can probably agree, most people would agree it's not a great idea given reputation these days, they might go to Hong Kong, they might go to Dubai, they might go to Singapore. So this question to me also speaks to a broader point about the importance of all of us in media and in government in keeping our eye on what the new loopholes for corruption continue to be.
Thank you. And we have now a third question, how the media can push the law enforcement authorities to do their work and investigate and prosecute the bribers and the solicitors that ask for bribes. So not only investigate it, but only make some pressure on the authorities. What can be done by the media for pressing?
I could talk about it from our experience. In my organization, which is Radio Free or Radio Liberty, which exists already for 60 years, it is prohibited any kind of activism. So I personally, as a journalist, cannot push anybody to do anything and it cannot even send an inquiry to a law enforcement. But as I mentioned earlier, we do have a great cooperation with NGOs. And for example, they translate our programs into a legal language, and they send these inquiries to a law enforcement, and if there is no response, they then go to court and demand to open a criminal investigation, and we have some successful examples of such cooperation with NGOs. And in our countries like ours, it actually works.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's not the remit of journalism or media to push anyone or exert pressure on anyone on purpose. However, if there is inactivity of one of the estates number 1, 2, or 3, like the judiciary, this can become a journalistic piece in itself. And reporting about it can also, maybe not exert pressure on the judiciary, but of course, shed light on certain deficiencies.
And of course, there is also the reaction of public opinion. In some cases, we have politicians who have been uncovered as corrupted people, go for elections again, and they are re-elected, although all the citizens know that they are corrupted. Some cases in Italy, I could tell you about it, but also in the United States, one guy of the Federal Bureau of Investigation at a conference referred of this strange history of a mayor of a city which was totally corrupted but re-elected again by the citizens. So the role of the media is important, but again, the common values of a community play an important role. I would propose to Andrew, if you are following your discussion, you can maybe react at the end, just before the coffee break, so we can listen to you and seeing you in the screen, unless you prefer to intervene now. There is a question related to Croatia. Maybe you can see it, no? In Croatia, we were waiting 7 years to justice system solve corruption case which involves ex-prime minister. What can journalism do to change justice system? Something that we have just discussed.
Ja bih, ako mogu, odgovorila na hrvatskom da izbjegnem bilo kakve pogreške u prijevodu. Naime, činjenica jest da u Hrvatskoj su otkrivene mnoge korupcijske afere koje još uvijek čekaju pravosudni epilog. Jedan od njih je upravo i afera vezana uz bivšega premijera Ivu Sanadera. Taj postupak je još uvijek u tijeku. Međutim, pravni sustav je kod nas naravno neovisan, izdvojen je hoću reći da na njega ne može nitko utjecati, niti zakonodavna, niti izvršna vlast. Prema tome, to je sada stvar na pravosuđu. Jedino što mogu učiniti novinarstvo je da cijelo vrijeme podsjeća da te afere još uvijek nisu riješene. Dakle, neprekidno pisati o njima, na taj način utjecati nitko ne smije na pravosuđe, ali jednako tako vrlo je važno da javnost na te afere ne zaboravi.
We do not have other questions, so I would like to ask Olaf if you can make your presentation about your project. Yes.
All right, so as said earlier at Reporters Without Borders, we decided to not only call for transparency of media ownership, but to deliver it. And this project, the Media Ownership Monitor, which basically does what it sounds like, it maps media ownership, was made possible by a grant of the German government, the Development Ministry, and we are running this since 2015, country by country. You can see the red pins, so 14 countries so far and counting. And just to give you a little bit of a sneak preview of what it looks like. So here you see, you know, a selection of the different countries we published so far. We can choose any of them. Let's do Serbia maybe for proximity, because all websites, all country websites look identical. In English and all relevant languages, you have basically a database where you can search either for media outlets or for individuals. With a quick introduction, let's say you are interested in TV stations in Serbia, you get the biggest 10, 12, 15, and then you can just click on any logo and you get a little profile of, in this case, Happy TV, a few important data points, and most importantly, the face behind. In this case, and you can click on it, a very interesting personality we only received after very intense, this is data journalism and investigative journalism, only this very picture, which comes from the police files. I mean, it's a mugshot from his police file. But also explaining and disclosing his other business interests and whatever sources we have are also listed here. So this is basically how the database works. You can also, if you are interested in individual owners, there you have basically a who is who of the Serbian media ownership family, so to speak. In addition to the database, we also compute indicators of risks to media pluralism based on the legal domain, technical criteria, and also the legal environment, like safeguards for transparency, concentration control, etc. So this is basically what the database looks like for each country. The methodology is openly available, so we are basically ready to deploy and roll it out almost everywhere. Just maybe a few quick snapshots which might be interesting just to show you what it could look like in certain places. So Morocco is interesting, as everybody would expect, of course, that the royal family is quite heavily involved. But what does it mean in detail? So you can go again to the database, and for example, you would get such an infographic really explicitly disclosing and explaining how and who exactly out of the royal family owns what and how. And I must say, just in concluding, because it was also mentioned earlier, what we found in each and every country, no matter where we go, that mostly the government or the state is the big spender or the biggest spender in media markets, and subsidies or state advertising in many, many ways, money that goes from ministries or state-owned companies to the media, that happens totally intransparently. There are usually no safeguards or any rules or transparency in place, and of course this is mostly used as a means of either rewarding or punishing specific media outlets, and this seems to be a pattern we see. Thank you for the opportunity of showing this.
This is a very important contribution and very interesting for all of us. Corruption is a global phenomenon, and international cooperation is absolutely important, and not only for the police or for the judiciary power, but also for journalism and public opinion.
If I may, a follow-up question. I think the research is really impressive, but a lot of real owners of the media outlets are hidden. They're not, you cannot see them from any registries, and you have to make an investigation to actually get to know who is there. And my question is this that databases covers the real beneficiary owners of media outlets or the final owners on the paper?
Yes, in fact, it's very difficult sometimes, but we are surprised that in the end we usually do find out. Even though, of course, not surprisingly, we talk about all sorts of different schemes of proxy owners, shell companies, offshore structures of sorts, specifically in Ukraine as well. In the end, it works well. For example, with court files. So if, for example, a certain media outlet is challenged in front of a court, then usually you find, even if it's an offshore company, the ultimate beneficial owner. This is one of the instruments we use, as well as GDPR was mentioned and the right to be forgotten. I think also on the positive end, we should mention access to information laws in almost every country now existing, working more or less okay, let's say, and we use it a lot to really get down to this particular piece of information. And even if we speak about private companies, as soon as they use concessions or public goods like frequencies, the spectrum, then again you have quite good chances and leverage to get down to this information by public and access to information requests.
Very much, and we have now a question for Natalie. Have you publicized the names of those judges in Ukraine who have purchased expensive foreign properties?
Yes, we published those names, and those investigations actually had a great resonance, and I'm glad to say that some property, so those judges, they were ruling the highest economical court of Ukraine, so they're very influential, and those decisions that they were taking, I guess, brought them a lot of money. And we found out that one of them is actually having registered on his relatives and friends 100 apartments in Ukraine, in Kiev, 100 luxury apartments in the most prestigious areas of the city. And also it was arrested just 2 days ago in Ukraine, so probably it will be hopefully a matter of assets recovery, and hopefully the money will come back to the country. But also we found that another judge who was also ruling this court have a property on the south of Spain in Marbella, and also he bought around 5 luxury apartments and 1 house, and is already doing some reconstruction there, but he is now asking for a political asylum in Vienna, in Austria. So he stresses that there is a political persecution against him in Ukraine. And yeah, so those names are public, of course.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have now a final question from the public, and then we will conclude this part with the coffee break. Please.
My name is Thomas Palmberg. I work for the National Anti-Corruption Unit in Sweden, in the police forces. In Sweden, we see that we have a little bit more corruption on local level in the municipalities. And the problem, what I see in Sweden and also other persons, is that the local media, the newspapers, they doesn't have this money today that they had before, because for many years ago people buy the newspapers. Today they read on internet. So the problem is that they don't have the resources to do their job for investigative journalism. Do you think that there is a need for local media in the future to have some kind of support from the state in all countries? I see that is a need in Sweden, and do you think it looks like in the same in other countries? That is my question.
Would you like to come?
Yes, thank you for this question. It relates to my earlier point of sustainability, and obviously it seems like in local market that's gone forever. If we particularly speak about very expensive investigative projects, one solution might be, and we see this already unfolding, to form coalitions of many local media, because you don't have investigative cases every day. You have it maybe like every month or 2 or 3, 4 times a year. So you can kind of reallocate your resources across the network. That might be one hint for a solution. As far as state subsidies are concerned, well, this can be probably depending on the environment again and the political culture around, either be a solution or making things worse even, depending really on how the money is being allocated and distributed. Again, talking about the money, I mean, as mentioned earlier, from my experience as an investigative journalist, I was working with the national public broadcaster in Germany, and that was quite, let's say, well equipped. Not so much only on journalism, the real work we might think of, but also in terms of having a substantial legal department in your back, because from the first phone call onwards, you will have a barrage of legal action, which you have to tally and work with. And a local newspaper might find it very difficult to do this. Secondly, I found it very reassuring, speaking about bad news, you might find in an investigation at one point, which is really, really complex and takes for months, that this is not a story. And then the luxury of dropping it and writing it off and not publishing something is also a matter of resources and sustainability. And my sense is that in the current state, particularly in local markets, you simply cannot afford to not publish. And then you write something which, of course, is not good journalism.
I would just agree with that point and speak to some specific examples. In the United States and in the United Kingdom, we've seen these local networks emerge where usually it's a non-profit that receives funding, say from Open Society or from large foundations, ProPublica in the United States, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in London, and they have actively partnered with local newspapers in specific regions and cities to report on different themes and different topics. So if the money can be found, and I know that's a very big if in lots of individual countries, I think the model is already out there and could be replicated, and we've seen in these projects incredible local impact. I'm a member of the Panama Papers team, and I think I can therefore say what I'm about to say, which is that there is a slight risk, I think, that investigative journalism is defined as only that reporting that results in a huge scandal. You know, if you're not toppling a president, then it's not an investigation. I think we as journalists need to do a better job of making the case that every story that investigates wrongdoing, it could be $1,000 of misspent money at a local school or a local hospital, but that is just as important as, you know, seeing a former president in handcuffs.
The solution for local media, according to Croatian Journalist Association, could be a national fund to allocate the public money to local media, but with transparent criteria. So I think this is the solution, should be worth to think about it.
So, thank you very much for this part of our discussion. We now have the coffee break, 10 minutes, and then we will have again Andrew on Skype, and we can discuss a bit longer with him and with our guests. So thank you for now. So I think that we can start the second part of our discussion. We are still waiting for Natalie, but our three guests are here, and we can have a new Skype call.
See you later.
Okay. Welcome back again. Could you follow our discussion?
I could, yes. I did follow the discussion and the responses.
Is there anything that you would like to say or to answer to some questions, or just to give us your point of view.
Thanks, Professor Nicoletti. I think there's a bit of a lag, so if I talk over you, please forgive me. So first, an apology. I didn't get the translation from Croatia, so I wasn't from Croatian, so I wasn't able to follow Tanya's intervention. So there are just a few things I'd like to react to. The first is on Olaf's presentation about.
Interrupt you, but quite disturb the connection. We can call him again, okay? We will call you again.
Hi. It sounds better.
Okay, thank you.
So on media ownership, there's one example that really I found very striking. It affects a European country, and it's related to the Panama Papers. I know from talking to an investigative journalist that there was one country in particular in Europe on which no stories could actually be published because the Panama Papers showed that the main newspapers in this particular country were owned by offshore companies or were receiving somehow suspicious payments from offshore companies. So that shows you how challenging it is to actually address issues of media transparency and corruption in the media, because there's huge variation across European countries and what media organizations are obliged to disclose. And when a lot of the corruption related to the media is conducted offshore, as was the case also in Malta, where the managing director of our largest newspaper was receiving payments from our Prime Minister's Chief of Staff to a British Virgin Islands company. Without the fluke, or rather without the hard work of the Panama Papers team, we would have absolutely no idea that this was going on. But there's also a separate dynamic at play. Independent newspapers don't necessarily need to be co-opted, and people who have dark secrets to hide don't necessarily need to retaliate with violence against journalists. They can also make independent media irrelevant, and they can do this by co-opting public broadcasters. And can you still hear me? Okay, we've seen this. I mean, in Italy, there was a recent case where the new director general of your public broadcaster is someone who let's say is not perceived as being independent or impartial, who has very, very particular political views, which are very closely aligned to the current administration. And when you have national broadcast media that has been co-opted by executive power, it's extremely easy to drown out investigative journalism. It's very easy to blunt its impact. So that's why I think that Olaf's work is especially important. It's not the only factor at play that's affecting the ability of investigative journalists to be effective and to be safe, but it's one that receives too little attention. On Ukraine, I have to say that I find the work being done by Natalie extremely inspiring, and this is something that my mother used to also write about, that she had incredible respect for journalists working in countries like the Ukraine, like Russia, like Azerbaijan, because there were so few checks on executive authority, and because journalists were really facing an entire system ranged against them. And so it's really inspiring to see Natalie do the work that she does. But I'm also mentioning it because one of the cases she brought up shows how difficult life has become for investigative journalists. Most of the corruption they uncover, even at a local level, has some kind of international dimension because corruption has been offshored. So the Ukrainian judge with property in Marbella in Spain, once an investigative journalist uncovers a story like that, let's say that the law enforcement authorities in their own country react. They're completely dependent on cooperation from the state in which the illicit funds were stored, either in real estate or companies or bank accounts. Let's say Spain is likely to cooperate, but many jurisdictions aren't. Most offshore tax havens will never cooperate with the national jurisdiction. They'll never repatriate the funds that were stashed away. And so what we're seeing is journalists starting to form coalitions to pursue these kinds of cases. What's not happening is that law enforcement agencies aren't responding to the same phenomenon in the same way. Cooperation between law enforcement agencies, even in Europe, is extremely limited. It's extremely clumsy, and it's completely dependent on voluntary efforts by national authorities who sometimes have something to lose in the investigation. So this dynamic of cross-border crime and corruption, local journalism and national law enforcement is completely unsustainable, and it will have to change. It's inspiring that journalists are beginning to change the way they work, like with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, like with the Daphne Project. But now it's also important to see the same kind of steps taken by law enforcement authorities. And I would say that the first steps should be taken in Europe, because European countries already cooperate in a lot of deeply sensitive matters. So you would think that they would be willing to cooperate even in the investigation of political corruption and organized crime. And that, for me, would be one of the biggest victories in the struggle against corruption, to have an integrated law enforcement authority in the European Union. And that brings me to the first question that was asked. Are we losing the fight against corruption? We've certainly suffered extraordinary losses in the last few years, and there have been precious few victories as well. But I want to avoid saying that we've lost the war and the battle has to start now. What I'll say instead is that it all depends on how we react to our losses. So after my mother was assassinated, a lot of people assumed it was inevitable that Malta would learn lessons and that the situation would improve for the better, because we like to hope that this is what comes out of tragedy, that something positive can emerge. But that completely depends on how we react as individuals, as communities, and also as an international community. And that reaction is not inevitably positive. After, say, journalists were assassinated in Russia, like Anna Politkovskaya, the situation got a lot worse. It didn't get better. It still hasn't got better. And we shouldn't be naive. We shouldn't imagine that the situation will always improve after tragedy. That will completely depend on our actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, this point on the importance of the international cooperation, it is on the floor for our discussion. Maybe you know that tomorrow there will be the announcement of the creation of a network of corruption prevention authorities here in Šibenik, which is a clear signal of this idea of strengthening the international cooperation. The Council of Europe has also another initiative in this direction, that is the creation of an academic network on the Corruption Convention in order to create a network of universities, not only of professors, researchers, but also young PhD students, young scholars who want to share their research products and want to give a contribution. And I think that the young people, young generation, are really strategic in this fight against corruption. And this is, and also I would like to mention the international cooperation at journalist level, because after the assassination of Daphne Caruana, there was also a strong reaction of the journalist community. I think I would like to mention in my country, Italy, a book has been published this summer. You certainly know, because there is an interview with you, and this kind of reaction of solidarity at all levels is absolutely important. I would like to ask if somebody in the public want to ask something, Andrew, or somebody here at the round table.
Yes, I know. He said it publicly. It's just not.
Anybody? Yeah. Natalie.
So I think the investigative journalism is now developing into globalization. So we have been seeing great examples of cross-border journalism. As corruption goes through borders, the journalism has to follow it. So besides of great examples of investigative cross-border journalism, such as Panama Leaks, which was mentioned today, there was also other tremendous cross-border investigations. And great example is a Paul Manafort trial in the U.S. And some of you probably know that it all started with the Ukrainian journalist, now the member of the parliament, Sergei Leshchenko, who uncovered how Manafort served to the corrupted Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych. Another example I was lucky to take part, to participate in, it is called From Russia with Cash. I'd like to share some insight about it. It's a British investigative documentary, and it was part of a huge campaign against dirty money coming into a British luxury property market. With the other journalists, we were posing as a Russian corrupted minister and his girlfriend in London, and we were trying to purchase an extremely expensive apartments in the city center. Some of it was up to 15 million pounds cost. And with hidden cameras, we filmed complete acceptance of such dirty money, even though we openly were saying that it was stolen from a Russian health ministry budget. And the film, after it was released, it was widely discussed in the society, and I guess it's catapulted the problem of dirty money wash through a luxury property market to a wider audience. And as we know, since then, some part of new legislation in the UK has been adopted, for example, Offshore Transparency Act. So this is the example of cross-border journalism which actually had an impact.
Yes, maybe picking up on one of Andrew's earlier points, like saying there might be a tipping point beyond which we might make things worse. I think there are some indications as well. I'm not saying that we should not do it, investigative journalism, but it might, in some instances and contexts, become inflationary when people get just so much of stories, I mean well-found and researched stories of wrongdoings, that they would just kind of shut down, and also, which seems quite widespread everywhere, lose even more trust in institutions, which again is not saying we shouldn't do it, but this is kind of an effect we see. Secondly, which might be a little bit related to this point is confirmation bias. Like you said, a convicted fraudster gets re-elected as mayor. If you take Trump and the latest New York Times revelations that he is obviously not the self-made billionaire, quite the opposite, plus a truckload of questionable tax schemes, does it really affect his base? I mean, the hard-boiled Trump supporters, maybe it makes them even more dedicated in supporting him. As he said, I can shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and people would still love me. And the third point, which is a very special element, but still maybe worth considering in very, very fresh, transitional, post-conflict contexts. If you, I mean, let's say, idealistically apply high-profile investigative journalism in such a very fragile context, it can derail transitional processes as well. Which, again, is not saying we shouldn't do it, but, I mean, just, you know, maybe advocating for some caution as well.
I think that again this is a good point, was mentioned also by Andrew in his first intervention, not a solitary way to fight against corruption, but to build a strong alliance with the institution and civil society. Would you like to add something?
There is a point that I wanted to make earlier, which is I think it especially applies to journalists, but also applies to law enforcement and public officials, which is that we live in an age now in which it's very easy to cast aspersions or to denigrate the work of someone else by saying it's incorrect, it's not factually true. I try and avoid repeating the catchphrase that has become common in the news industry, so I won't say the word FN. But I think for me a big lesson with the Panama Papers came when, despite the fact that we had documents, we had black on white the name of the daughter of the former Prime Minister of Pakistan. And then she'd say publicly, it's not me. Had nothing to do with that company. You journalists are a bunch of liars. And as surprising as that is, I think journalism increasingly should try and adopt a process of, as we'd say in English, showing how the sausage is made. That is, what are our processes for research? How do we verify our information, and how have we come to reach these conclusions? So I think what ICIJ is trying to do, and what many journalists are thinking of doing, is engaging more with the public on how we do investigations, and really pushing out as much as we can, and where we can, documents that we rely on, so that we try and avoid falling into this trap of he said, she said. And that's something that journalism, I think, could do a better job of. Traditionally, journalism has had a bit of a secretive, sexy mystique around it. Somehow journalists are geniuses who have secret sources that they meet in the middle of the night, and then all of a sudden they produce great investigations. That is very true for some journalists. Other journalists, like me, there's nothing special about me. I'm lucky to get a document. Where I can, I'm going to publish that document so that people can believe me more than they're going to believe the person who, of course, will scream until they're blue in the face that they're innocent.
Just maybe a quick footnote, because I think that's really an important point. There is a distinction between leak journalism and investigative journalism. Just putting a document into the public domain is just actually the opposite of journalism, which always comes with a responsibility.
We have now a new question on our screen: how to ensure that the laws on transparency of media ownership work in practice? What are enforcement and supervisory mechanisms?
Example, just recently, one television channel in Ukraine changed its ownership, and the owner, we found out that the new owner is the citizen of Germany from a very small city called Kunzel, and we found out that he is actually middle-range businessman reselling the used cars and having no other business. And in the Ukrainian registry, you would see his name as the name of the beneficial owner of the television channel. Our investigation actually proved and showed that the new owner of this channel is a pro-Russian politician who is going to use this channel in order to win in the next parliamentary elections, and we already seen the change of editorial policy of this television channel. But the Ukrainian law, for example, says that there is only a small fine if you are lying in the documents who is the real beneficial owner is. So this is a question of a political will. If there was a political will in Ukraine to, let's say, overcome the influence of pro-Russian media such as this channel, then I think that it's possible to adopt a new legislation.
I can just support this. There is probably the most modern and advanced law on media ownership transparency we have seen so far in Ukraine, which is great. But enforcement of this law is a problem, to say the least, because the fine, I think, for non-compliance is less than 1,000 euros maximum, and for an Ukrainian oligarch, I mean, they just laugh about it and go on with their businesses and don't even pay attention. I think one answer to this question, again, might be international collaboration in terms of maybe even something like a media transparency register, where on public level this information is being exchanged, and also where media ownership transparency regulation is being harmonized. Again, the Council of Europe has already produced recommendations, and harmonization, I think, is essential to facilitate this exchange of information, because mostly it's trans-border.
Very much was a very good and concrete example of supervisory mechanism and the problem of good legislation, but also good implementation of the law. Any other question from the public? This is not the case. So, Andrew, would you like to add some final words? We are now concluding.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. The only thing that springs to mind is that we find that the media is often attacked when law enforcement authorities don't follow up on its work. So the subjects of reporting are often allowed to attack the credibility of the people doing the reporting. When there aren't arrests, when there isn't a criminal investigation, people often think, okay, then it was just smoke, there's no fire, the allegations are unfounded, because there are very few people who want to believe that their institutions could be so weak or so compromised that they wouldn't follow up on real facts. And that's definitely the case in most European countries, I would say. We tend to have an unthinking faith in the police, in the courts, because life becomes impossible if we no longer trust those institutions. And so the press often becomes a victim of this, this lack of action from official authorities. And so what Will has said about showing readers how the sausage is made is a great reaction to this, because in the absence of a criminal investigation, journalists actually have to prove their own cases, whereas before all they had to do was show evidence of wrongdoing, and then official institutions would take over from there. When that no longer happens, journalists often don't have a choice except to really up the ante. Otherwise, they become victims of retaliation. So the classic understanding of journalism as simply reporting the facts is sometimes unsustainable in a situation where your work could be suppressed because of what you do. So often, sometimes you need to become a bit more of an activist, work with activists as closely as possible, without compromising your independence as a journalist, because in places it's simply become a question of survival. So.
Very much. I now ask to our guest if anybody would like to add something or not. This final word from
just briefly reiterating that nobody should expect more from journalism to deliver than the environment in which journalism is operating permits. Maybe accept some very, very brave, maverick-type blips of activism, which of course are great, but this is not the normal. So this is, I think, a responsibility for civil society, for society at large, and for governments to create this environment.
I'm going to make one cheeky request, and that is that anyone who enjoyed this presentation, donate to a media organisation. Doesn't have to be ICIJ, but it can be. But donate, and donate regularly, so that you show your support that encourages investigative journalism to keep doing what it does.
Ja bih samo na kraju citirala jednog mog kolegu koji je vrlo dobro zaključio da je zadaća novinara da razotkrivaju, upozoravaju na korupcijske afere. Zadaća je pravosuđa da dovede to do kraja, a zadaća je države da stvori uvjete da i jedni i drugi to mogu raditi neometano.
I think also I'd like to add that in countries like ours, it's a huge responsibility for journalists in the meaning of developing democracy. And I think another hidden tip that can be done is journalists, even those who are working under such conditions on oligarch-owned channels and so on, I think they can unite around standards and try to protect their right for their job without interference. And I think that this journalism solidarity is another step to be taken in countries like ours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to our guests, to Olaf Stenfat, Will Fitzgibbon, Andrew Caruana Galizia, Sanja Rabusin-Pavic, Natalie Sedlecka. Thanks to all of you for this very nice discussion. We heard a very interesting presentation, question and answer. I think that the most important thing from my point of view was to listen to people who are really strongly committed in fighting against corruption, but at the same time with a very realistic and pragmatic approach. Not naive persons, no rhetoric, but a very concrete, reasonable approach. And this was a very serious discussion. We have to fight and to stand for our principles and values, but at the same time we need to be aware of the effects of our actions. We are aware of the fact that we need a strong alliance. We appreciated the role of investigative journalism, but we have heard at the same time a very clear message. Don't leave journalists alone. They need support, financial support, of course, because this is their job and they live. And we have to give them the possibility of fighting against corruption by their job, and also supporting the public opinion. So I think that was a very stimulating discussion, very serious one, appreciated very much. More times we have heard how important is the international cooperation, and so I think that the Council of Europe has among its priorities the fight against corruption through this kind of events and through all the initiatives that are going on in legislation, institution, education, and supporting the media. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Andrew, and bon courage.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Regards from my brother Matthew as well. And to